This lesson, we're going to be making the list fully interactive. So far we have content coming from a JSON file that also stores to local storage, and that gives us the ability to make some updates. So we're able to toggle the active and non-active, so the different statuses, and that stayed consistent within the My List. This lesson, we're taking it one step further. We're going to have the option to remove items from the list and also still be able to refresh the page. Also reload the initial JSON data, so make a request to the JSON data and load that onto the page, and then also finally also add to the list, so adding in additional items into the list. And these are also going to be interactive. They're also going to get stored to the local storage, and then you can also remove these if you need. This lesson is going to be covering quite a bit, so let's get started. In the last one, we made the list items clickable, so we can click each one of the list items. And in this lesson, we want to make them even more dynamic, where we can set and make these interactive. I'm also going to be adding in to the list item, creating a class called box, and adding the box padding to each one of the items. And we'll set a default width of that. And also setting a margin, so top and bottom of 10 pixels and right and left of 0, and going into the JavaScript as we're constructing the divs. We can do a class list and add the box class to the elements. So it's going to space them out a little bit more. And also, actually, let's make this slightly less. So do 5, and then also adding in a border and a really faint type border around it, so we can see each one of the list items. So we wanted to have an option that we can add items to the list, and we also want to have an option where we can remove items from the list. So right now we've got the ability to click. We also want to have an option to remove it from the list entirely. So let's add that in, and as we're constructing the elements, we're going to append and add in a span to the div. And the span is going to give us an option to remove the items. So just creating, and just as we created the div, we're using create element, and we'll create the span. And then within the span, it'll just have some text content. And right now we can just have it as an X. And then for the div, append the span content. So that gives us our X there. And also we want to apply some styling to the span. We don't have to do anything specific because it's already going to be contained within the box. So box span, and you can set a width for it of 20 pixels, height of 20 pixels, border, and we'll make a red border around it. And of course, you can style it as needed. And actually, I'm going to decrease the border radius, so it's not as round. And we'll transform it into an uppercase X. So that gives us an X where we can delete content. And I'll set the color to this to be red. So it's always going to be red within that element. So now we've got the X's, and I'll also add in margin to the left. So that keeps the X slightly off, and span. Let's add an event listener. So this event that we're listening for is going to be a click event, and fires off the object. And right now we'll just track it into the console. So when we're clicking, whether we click on the X or not, it's still taking and firing off both click events. So we want to stop that from happening, where it's only going to fire off only the event for the X button. And there's a method within JavaScript that you can stop the propagation. And what this will do is this will stop it from moving up to the next level. So now when I click the X, it's no longer toggling, it's just firing off that one event. But if I click the parent and not clicking the span, it's going to allow me to still click and underline. And actually, I don't like that it is doing the text decoration of the underline. So how about we get rid of that altogether? And there's also options as well that you could do that. So what we want to do is we want to remove out the X, and also for the box span, once we hover over it, let's set the cursor to pointer. And we'll also update the background color so that it's slightly off. So now whenever we hover over it, we see there's a slight tint to the X for the color. And also set the X to be black. So now whenever they get clicked, what we want to do is we want to actually remove that particular element. We have the index value of the element from the MyList that we can remove. And we also know which element it is on the page that we can remove as well. So let's select the parent, so div remove. And then we'll also take the element out of the MyList. And because this is an array, we have a way to remove the item using splice. So within the MyList, and I'm actually going to move the span down to the bottom. So within the MyList, using JavaScript splice method, and we have the index value of where we want to slice, and we want to remove out one item from the list. And we'll console log the MyList just to make sure that it's still consistent. And that's what one of the real challenges is, to make sure that we're consistent with what the user sees as well as what we've got within our list. So we're able to effectively update the list, and that means that we should save it to the local storage as well. And I'll create a function, and I'll create a function just called save to storage. So what this one will do is, since we're doing the same thing multiple times, it's easier if we just create, and anytime we do an update to it, we just run the one function that saves it to storage. So that's also going to clean up your code as well. So every time we make an update to the MyList, make sure that you are saving it to the storage. So we also want to, so now that we've removed items, it's actually removed it from the local storage. So we want to have a way to reload the contents from the JSON file into the local storage. So let's set that up as well. And we'll call it function reload. So what this will do is this is actually going to reload the contents, and that will just run the fetch. So it gives us an opportunity to kick that off and reload the content from the web URL. And we can create a button on the page that will run that. So button 1, and using the document, create element. Let's create an element on the page, and this element is going to be a regular button. And button 1, set the text content, reload JSON data, and then whenever the button 1, and add an event listener, and whenever the button gets clicked, what will happen is it will run the reloader function. So let's do a refresh, and we need to also add the button on the page. So button 1, and actually I don't want to append it to the output as we're clearing the output, so we can append it to the document body and append the button 1 object to the body. So that will always give us an opportunity to reload the data back to its initial loading coming from the JSON file. So also, if you want to add to the list, so we just got to make sure that the structure is going to be the same. So we need to create 2 input areas, and we can set those up to add to the list. So let's create the inputs as well as the button. So input 1, and using the document, And you could do this in regular HTML as well. So I'm just creating the input and also input 2, and this is going to be the number of guests. So create element, and it's also going to be an input, and we'll change the types. And then we also need another button, and this will be the one that adds it to the list. So create elements, and the element that we're creating is going to be a button. So let's add all of this to the page. We'll create one main container. So using the document create, and this is just going to be a div. So we can add both the inputs and the content into the div. So let's add that in and append to the div. So div 1 append, and input 1, div 1 append, input 2, and div 1 append the button 2. And then lastly, let's add it to the page. So add the div 1 to the page. So that gives us our inputs. Now let's update it. So button 2 text content add to list. So that gives us a button that will add content to the list. Let's turn this into input 1 and add via placeholder. So the input 1 and set attributes. So the placeholder, we'll just say name. So there's the attribute added to that. And also for input 2, we'll set the number. And we don't actually need a placeholder for this, because this is actually going to be type, and the type is going to be number. So let's do a quick inspect on our HTML. So now that it's a number type, we can move it up and down with the number. Also, let's set some default values. So input 2, and set the value for that to be 2. So it always has a default value. So that way we don't need the placeholder for it. And so what we want to happen is whenever the user clicks add to list, we want to add it to the list. So we need to add an event listener to the button. So taking the button 2, let's add our event listener to the button 2. So whenever that button gets clicked, we want to run the function, and we'll just call it add to list. And then we'll create that function down here where we've got the rest of the functions. To list, and we don't need to pass in any parameters. It's going to get the content from the inputs, and these are global. So the input 1 and input 2 are global. Let's select those values, and for now we'll just console log out the input 1 value. So we want the current value of whenever the button gets clicked, and input 2 value. And let's save that. So now when we add to here to the list, and let me open up the console, and we'll clear it, so we get the content from the inputs. And we also have to make sure that it's consistent with what we have within the JavaScript, the JSON object. So we need to have a value for name, guests, and status. So let's construct that object. So our temporary object, and having a name, and the value for the name is going to be whatever we've got for input 1 value, and then just comma separated out. And then we had for guests, and call that input 2 value, so it's the number. And then the status by default can always be a Boolean value, so we'll just set it to be false. So that's going to create the object. So next up we want to add this object. So we want to add it to the list, and we also want to add it to our current MyList. So MyList and push. We're going to push the my object into the MyList. And we'll want to run the save to storage of the MyList. So going down to where we're pushing the object into the my list. So we'll always add it into the storage. So let's see what happens. So now whenever we refresh, we've got that new item, but we also want to add it right to the page. So make to the list. So we can get the index value of this item. And that index value is going to be whatever the current list length is going to be. So let's set up get the value. And this is going to be whatever our temporary my list length is. So this is whatever we've got for the first item there. And then before, as we're making the list, we can send the value, which is going to be the index value of the item, and then also the my object, which we can also add to the list. So that way, as long as our structure is consistent, we should be able to add items to the list, and then they should still function the same way. We should be able to do a refresh and have all of the items in the list. We can remove stuff from the list, refresh it, add new items into the list, remove items from the list, so that they're all interactive and clickable, and our list is fully dynamic, saved into local storage. And if we ever want to refresh our JSON, we could just do a reload of the JSON, so getting from the JSON list. So if we're updating the JSON list, then we can always update and do an update of the content within the JSON list. Hey, in this lesson, we're going to be almost wrapping up the project, where we're going to be adding the option to reload the JSON data, and also adding another button that we can click to remove items from the list. Also having different functions that are going to handle some of the functionality that we've been creating, so separating those out so it's more logical within the application, and then also adding input elements that can add to the list, so dynamically creating those, adding those to the page, so that whenever we click a button, we can add items to the end of the list, and then also remove stuff from the list and reload the JSON. So creating the fully dynamic interactive list object. That's what we're doing in this lesson. So go ahead and add those to your own project. And coming up, we're just going to do a quick finalization of the app.